Internet. Today we're going to be talking about the internal dynamics of antisocial personality disorder and psychopathy. I'm going to talk about it because it was a topic that was requested by a subscriber, and I like to answer those topics when I can. And because I have a little bit of experience with antisocial personality disorder and psychopathy, I felt at ease to talk about it. However, and this is a big however, I am not an expert on the topic. I'm not working in a jail setting, so I don't meet them regularly. And second of all, I am myself not a forensic psychologist, meaning I'm not like in the process of trying to understand the mind in the criminal system. It's more that sometimes you meet them or in private practices or in institutions, but it's more like they have other forms of mental illness that are added to it, so it's not a clean picture, but it rarely ever is, if ever, to be honest. But I wanted to make it very clear so you don't like use my word as a gospel, because it isn't. It's like my perspective, my way of seeing since having met them a couple of times, those types of profiles. So to back my thinking, I'm going to refer you to two books. The Psychopath of Quentin Debrey, which is a very short and very good book. Like, it goes to the point. It really tells us what the psychopath is. And Aggression in Personality Disorders and Perversion by Otto Kernberg, which the same goes into good detail on what it is and how does it work. The Otto Kernberg one goes into much more nuanced detail because it talks about borderlines, narcissistic, antisocial, and perverse. But here I'm only going to talk about antisocial personality disorder and psychopathy. So, first and foremost, is there a difference between the two? So, yes, there is. The difference, or differences should I say, are as follows. Psychopathy is not really recognized as an official diagnosis. Like, of course, people have plenty of imagination, but you don't really put it that way. What you do put, however, on the file is antisocial personality disorders or antisocial tendencies. That's the official one. However, I have seen people make a clear distinction. However, what unifies both of them is that they're kind of very similar. Like, symptoms are not necessarily that different. It's a question of extremes. So, antisocial personality disorder is here, and psychopathy is here. So it's the same spectrum, but psychopathy is notably worse. It's more extreme, more powerful, and more full-fledged. It's like if antisocial personality disorder was a milder form of it. However, it doesn't mean that it's without consequence, right? So that's pretty much the distinction, or it is the distinction as I understand it. So in terms of internal dynamics, because this is a very, very interesting topic, because these types of people often have very little awareness of the internal world. Like, their eigenwelt, their inner world, is quite noticeably absent. When you ask them if they daydream, if they have fantasies, they won't really answer that, or they really won't even understand why you're asking them. So it's very interesting to me that from the get-go, when you exchange with those people, it's like if there's a form of emptiness in the relationship. Something that's very notable when you start to investigate the wants, the desires. All of that seems a little odd, as if there was some form of emptiness. Sometimes, even counter-transferentially, you can really feel empty, like if there was nothing within you. And I think that's pretty much a telltale sign of psychopathy or of a form of antisocialness. Because here I'm not going to necessarily be talking about the actions that they commit, but really their internalized version of themselves and in the psychotherapeutic relationship. There's something that's strikingly bizarre and might seem at first to the clinician that there's something that's very schizoid, but it's not really the case, because they don't have a rich internal life. It's more like they have an absence of internal life. What is good or what is bad is more dictated by the outside world than by what they really want. Meaning that in terms of individuality, they're not really there. They're just as if they adhere to society's values on the surface, but they don't mind breaking them when it suits them. So rule breaking is, of course, a major issue in both of these disorders, as fundamentally, because they don't necessarily have a well-built superego, they are more prone to fundamentally act and discharge tension. Meaning that, for example, let's say your average neurotic, right, is gonna have a drive that's gonna build in an internal tension. Like, for example, I don't know, let's say I can just anything. Let's say the person wants to eat McDonald's, right? That's their drive. But they're gonna have an internalized guilt of like, oh no, well, we took on 3 pounds yesterday, so no way we're gonna do this. And there's an inner conflict with the superego is like, oh, we spend too much, oh, we do this, oh, we do that, right? So that internalized that drive is internalized and is conflict upon what to act upon. In psychopathy, there's no such conflict, or at least not that I have ever seen. It's more like there's something of tension, and the tension needs to be discharged. So there's conflict, but the conflict is not really psychically there. It's more directly expelled, and that expulsion is virtually a testimony to the fact that they don't have an inner world that's functional, because they have to reject it outright. So I was talking about the superego. Here, the superego, and how I use it, is the internalized rules of society and of the family that are in our minds. Well, in the case of ASPD and psychopathy, there is no thorough internalization of the rules. The rules are seen more as obstacles, something to be overcome or twisted, rather than something that makes sense or meaning. It's like something that's in their way. And that's another big point of these forms of issues, is that others are seen as all objects, like tools to relieve tension, or people that are going to stand in their way. But they're not going to be seen as necessarily separate individuals, as would be the case in, let's say, neurosis, right? So others are not necessarily properly differentiated from them, and they don't necessarily emotionally get others. What they do have, though, is a sort of intellectualized version of empathy, meaning they're not necessarily going to feel the empathy, but they're going to know what is empathy, like intellectually, and be able to mimic it when they're not too bad. The fact that they're not connected with their inner world makes it very hard for them to tolerate any frustration. Like, you might see that very often in works of fiction, when the psychopath or the person with ASPD is frustrated, they don't handle that too well. They start exploding in rage, they start hurting people, they start to self-destruct. That's because I think they don't necessarily have a good connection internally. So what happens in the outside world cannot be taken in and digested within their psyche, meaning that any bad experience cannot sit there and be slowly broken down and digested. For example, if we go for Bayon's framework of the alpha function, meaning what the mother gives to the baby, that help, that psychic help, she interprets what's happening to him, she gives him the needs, and all of that help is going to be internalized. The psychopath does not really have that, in the fact that in a way he can't soothe himself. The only thing he can do is discharge. So this tension, it's not going to be internalized, dealt with, and digested. It's going to be expelled. And that expulsion is when they become dangerous. Because if, for example, they have a sexual tension, it's going to be discharged in, for example, sex in the best possible way. If they, for example, they have a consenting partner, that can lead just to a normal sexual relationship. But if they don't have that and they need to discharge, they will discharge on someone else. Meaning they might be sexual assault. They might hurt others because others are not considered really as proper others. They're considered more like tools to be used by them for their needs. In this case in point, for example, let's say the sexual tension. So once it's relieved, what's very special in this situation is that they don't necessarily feel guilt. Because the superego is not that well built. So they don't really regret what happens. For example, if you have them in a conversation and push them to, like, let's say, talk about what happened, often it's very poor in terms of, like, what they can say. They just say that it happened, but they don't explain why it happened. They can't really, like, tell you what was in the inner world because they're not really connected to it. So that means that you only have like a surface level understanding because they only have a surface level understanding of what is happening within themselves. There's another point that you should understand is that they might also understand that you, as a therapist or as anyone else, have an internalized framework. They understand that you have a superego, but they don't really have an eatable superego themselves. So then they understand that. So they might pretend to have it, pretend to feel guilty, pretend that what they did was terrible, but they don't really believe that. And that not really believing it is also a way of trying to use you as a tool to get some form of leniency, or if they think that by manipulating you, they can get away with something, then they're going to try. And you have to be very careful with this because they might be very good actors and they might try and really convince you that, like, they regret it, but they don't really. And when you make it very clear to them that you don't necessarily care for the question of guilt, or that you're not gonna, be like a priest or cop or anything else of that ilk, that you know what they did, but you're not there to, like, pass judgment, you're there to understand, then they might shift and say, yeah, I did it, and admit completely what happened. And this can be very surprising if you're not aware of it, but they don't necessarily have any moral grounds. They don't really care about morals. They understand that others have them, but they really don't. So once you start trying to distance yourself from a position of authority, then they might become more open to what has happened. But what you have to be very careful is that you have to always put them within the responsibility, because it is a responsibility. So you can't say, oh, it's not your fault, because then they will just go into that and just completely accept that and in a way get away with it. So they are responsible for what they're doing and the actions that they take. But, this is the big but, as a clinician you have to really know when to put the law as a sanction and when to try and work therapeutically on trying to understand what has happened for them. So how I do it, and remember, I'm not an expert, so this is you can be highly critical of what I'm going to say, and perhaps even you should. How I do it is that I tell them that I want their perspective on what has happened. I don't necessarily want them to tell me that it didn't happen. I don't want them to necessarily tell me how innocent they are or how the victim deserved it. On the contrary, what happened for them. And often that what happened for you, what is your perspective, allows them to shift from a persona of, like, I'm pretending something, to something that's real. But that real isn't like a genuine self. It's more like unmasking themselves. But then you realize that there's a lot of emptiness, like they don't really know, and they don't really care to know. It's like they know that they're different. There's a difference in themselves, and they suffer from it, but they're not in connection with that suffering, meaning that it makes the whole process of psychotherapy very, very complicated. And also because to an extent, they also try and deny what they do, to afterwards. Like they might admit, and then they might say it's not that bad, or go back to something that's, as Kernberg points out, psychopathic transference. He used it for the narcissist, but it works for psychopaths and ASPD as well. That there is like, oh, it's okay, it was in the past. It's okay, I'm not like that anymore. Like a sort of trivialization of experience with the therapist. So what is very interesting with psychopaths is that we have this cultural framework in which we think that they're brilliant masterminds, murderers, and whole detailed stuff. They're none of that. Some of them are very, very, how can I say, unintelligent. Not necessarily in a IQ sense, but more in a, they don't really know how to cope with their frustrations, and they make foolish mistakes, like really foolish mistakes, because they're overwhelmed by what is happening inside of them, and because they have no frame within them, they just act out what is inside without it being processed or processable. So that means that they are in a lot of difficulties from the get-go. So they might seem charming, but as soon as you even scratch, all that charm is gone, this rage. They also, and that's very interesting, are not necessarily able to connect with others because they can't connect with themselves, they can't connect with others, right? So that lack of connection also prevents them from fully understanding the emotions of others. Often the emotions of others are seen like some kind of conundrum, a strange intellectual thing to like investigate, but not something that they feel connected with. In my mind, and this is my very special and personal way of seeing things, they sometimes make me think of scientists like cold, like I'm going to go in, get the data and come out without them being affected, as if their real, true, deep connection to mankind was broken, because often they have experienced a lot of violence, suffering, abuse, and there's that form of disconnect from them. There's also a whole point in which they're not capable of caring for someone. So this is also one of the main myths of psychopaths, is that they are sadists. They're not necessarily sadists, they don't necessarily enjoy hurting others, but because others are seen as tools, well, what do you do with a tool? You use it. And using others hurts them, always. So they use others for their own needs and their own benefits without even caring. And that's a big problem because they can't really care. For example, Debrey talks about psychopathic mothers and how they don't care for their infants, don't care that the infant is hungry, they don't care that the infant is in pain or has rashes on its bottom because it's not being cleaned. They don't care about any of this because they can't care, because no one has cared for them. Therefore, they can't give what they don't have, and they don't have an internal world, they don't have internal representations, happy representations, caring, loving. They don't really understand that. For them it's used or be used, destroy or be destroyed, but it's not like love and be loved, not in that deep sense. It's more like to use is to be powerful, and to be used is to be weak and pathetic. And often acts of care are seen like that. It is seen for the person with ASPD or psychopathy as a form of weakness. Oh yeah, you're helping others because you're weak, and sometimes even worse, you're a piece of trash. There's also that fundamental core belief that love is but an illusion, and the people that believe in it are but idiots, which shows to us clinicians how fundamentally they've been brutalized and hurt to have come to this conclusion that love is an illusion, because that's what it is. Love is not an illusion. It's one of the strongest emotions ever, but for them to believe that shows how they've been deeply hurt within their humanness, within themselves, and that they can't trust others, not necessarily in a paranoid way, but really a deep, detached untrustworthiness of the other. So what's also very important is that psychopaths and ASPD, which I lump together, but as I told you earlier, it's a spectrum, right? Often don't seek therapy. Like something that's very hard to do with them in the first place. And even when they do, they sometimes want to ditch because it's too complicated, or because it confronts them to the internal world, which is very complicated. And I talked earlier about how they didn't have superego. I should be more precise and say they don't have an Oedipal superego, i.e. the rules of society don't make sense. What they do have, though, is an archaic or early superego, a la Melanie Klein, right? In which fundamentally they know that the rule is more destroy or be destroyed, and that they understand. So they can feel very persecuted very quickly, and this is also what leads them to discharge. Because they can't internalize any form of guilt or responsibility, they directly expulse it. But if they were to internalize it, then they would be destroyed by the early superego. Therefore, they have to throw it out. It's, as Kernberg also notes in this book, it's not, they don't do that because they secretly want to be punished or unconsciously they want to be punished. They're doing this because they fundamentally lack a strong superego. And the conflict at their core is about the ego and the world, not ego superego, or not id, ego, and the world. It's more like the ego and the id are together against the outside world. So that pretty much sums it up. I hope you found it interesting, and I hope that the subscriber that requested it is happy about the video. And if you have anything you'd like to ask, feel free to leave a comment. I'll see you in the next one.